Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Matt, and today we are making a part 2 to a video that I made about a year ago. 10 cheap things you can do to improve your homebrew or your beer. So really we're going to make a part 2 where this will be 10 more cheap things that you can do to improve your homebrew. Similarly to the first video, we are going to start with cheap items and progressively are going to get more expensive throughout the video. So we are going ahead and get started. So for the first thing I want to talk about, and the cheapest thing on the list, is to start watching homebrewing YouTube channels and to listen to brewing podcasts. There is a plethora of information out there on YouTube and podcasts that are available on Apple Podcast or Spotify. If you haven't listened to podcasts before, I would highly recommend doing so, as there's just so much information out there. I do have a lot of YouTube channels that I follow, and you already are doing so by watching my channel, which I appreciate. But there is also a lot more YouTube channels out there that I want to recommend, and then there's also a few podcasts that I want to recommend. So excuse me while I read off the list here. So for the YouTube channels, I'd recommend Homebrew for Life, David Heath Homebrew, Genus Brewing, The Homebrew Challenge, The Brew Show, The Apartment Brewer, Short Circuited Brewer, and Beer and Barbecue by Larry. Now there's a lot more YouTube channels out there than just those that do homebrewing content such as mine, but those are the ones that I can personally recommend that you follow, as they provide really great information. For podcasts, I recommend following Beersmith, Brewlosophy, Brew Strong, and the Brew Lab. Obviously, again, there's a lot more podcasts out there that follow brewing content, but that's a good starting point. If you are new to this hobby, make sure to go and subscribe to those channels, as you will not be disappointed. The second thing on my list I want to talk about is using yeast nutrient. The one I can personally recommend is the one brand from Yeast, but there are lots of other types of yeast nutrient out there. Yeast need amino acids, nitrogen, fatty acids, and vitamins. It's essential to yeast health and for them to reproduce during the fermentation process. There's a lot of natural things that get generated through the mashing process. This is really kind of like an extra multivitamin that you kind of throw into it to make sure the yeast can do their job. Using yeast nutrient, the most important times to use it is when you are making a high gravity beer, or if you're using a lot of fermentable sugar that isn't coming from the mash. So yeah, I would highly recommend starting to use yeast nutrient, as it's a very cheap thing to do. Yeast has a large impact on flavor and aroma, so yeast health is very important. The third item on my list is to start using brewing salts, and another term for this is water chemistry. This might sound scary, but it's really simple with using a few online calculators, and you only need a few ingredients to get started. I'd recommend using a blank slate for your brewing water to start using distilled water. Distilled water is void of any minerals, so you need to pretty much build up your water profile from distilled. So the things I'd recommend buying to get started is to start using distilled water, and then to buy baking soda, Epsom salt, calcium chloride, calcium carbonate, canning salt, and gypsum. Brewing salts can make an impact on flavor to make things perceived to be more bitter or make things perceived to be more malty. This obviously isn't an in-depth guide on how to add brewing salts. There's a ton of videos online. In fact, I plan on making one here on my YouTube channel within the next few months. But for now, check out YouTube and check out how to add some brewing salts. It's going to recommend to use some sort of online calculator like Brew and Water. Beersmith 3 also has a water tab on the software to help you do brewing salt additions. If you'd like to learn specifically how to do it on Beersmith 3, I do have a guide on that to walk you through the water tab on Beersmith 3 that I'll post down in the information section below. But in conclusion, brewing salts can make a measurable impact on beer flavor, and it is not very expensive to get started. The fourth thing I can recommend is to try the style before you make it, and also to start reading the BJCP style recommendations on the BJCP's website. If you've never heard of the BJCP, it's essentially the gold standard for style information and style metrics. What is also available on the BJCP website is beer recommendations that fit that style. For example, an IPA has a few examples, including Bell's Two Hearted, Stone IPA, and Russian River Blind Pig IPA. My fifth recommendation is to start entering homebrewing competitions. Sometimes there are state-run competitions, sometimes there's national competitions, and sometimes there's even small competitions that are run outside of homebrewing supply stores. Entering these competitions is the best way to get unbiased feedback on your beer. This is important if you are looking to see if you're generating any off flavors, and also if anyone's able to give you unbiased feedback, it's BJCP certified judges. BJCP certified judges have to go through a few different types of examination to get their credentials to start judging beer. For example, to become a judge, you need to take an entrance exam, a web exam on beer styles, ingredients, beer characteristics, and the brewing process. They also need to take BJCP beer exams and practical tasting exams. And lastly, they need to take a judge written proficiency exam. So if anyone's able to give good feedback, it is definitely the judges in competitions. So I'd highly recommend starting to look for competitions in your area. There are AHA certified competitions and BJCP certified competitions, so you can check their websites to look for competitions in your area. My sixth recommendation is to start using brewing software like Beersmith 3 or Brewfather. I've already alluded to using software a few times in this video, as it's very important to make recipes. Brewing software can help you scale recipes, it can help you with your water chemistry, it can help you adjust your gravity, it can help you build recipes to stay in certain guidelines. It can show you what your IBU, your SRM, your expected gravity, your boil off rates. It has different equipment profiles, and it has a lot to unpack there. So I'd highly recommend checking out brewing software if you've not already. If you're interested in checking out Beersmith 3, again, I have a video on that, which I'll post in the information section below. Brewfather is also a very, very popular version of brewing software out there. If you're looking for free software, Brewer's Friend is available. It's just an online website that has a bunch of online calculators you can use, and also you can build recipes on it as well. Just keep in mind, with free software, you are always going to be limited to what you can do on those softwares. And also with Beersmith 3, I know you can get a free trial. I'm unfamiliar with other different types of software, if they provide free trials or not, but I'm sure they do. The seventh thing I want to talk about is probably the most important thing on this entire list, and that is switching to brew in a bag if you are an extract brewer. Brew in a bag is the cheapest way to get into all grain brewing. It's the only way to have complete creative control over your recipes. It's also easier to get into brew in a bag than it is traditional 3-vessel brewing, as you typically don't need to sparge or Vorloff in brew in a bag brewing. Also, to get started, the only thing you need is a large enough kettle to do full wort boils, and you need a mesh bag to do the brew in a bag. And you can typically find those on online retailers or your local homebrew shop. My eighth recommendation is to start taking pre-boil gravity readings. And this is to really ensure that you always hit your target gravity at the end of the brew day. Have you ever finished a brew day and then you take your final gravity reading and you find that you're 5 or 10 or even 20 points off of your gravity? Well, that can typically be avoided by knowing how well you mashed directly after your mash step by taking a pre-boil gravity reading. You can do this by simply just taking a sample of your wort after mash and taking a gravity reading with a hydrometer or a refractometer. Just keep in mind, if you're using a hydrometer, they're calibrated to read at around 65 or 70 degrees, and if you just mashed out, you're probably sitting at around 170 degrees. So you do your best to cool off that sample as low as you can get it. It doesn't need to be 60 or 70 degrees to take an accurate reading. You can use online calculators to help adjust that based on the temperature. So if you have like 90 or 100 degree wort that you're testing with a hydrometer, you can simply use some online calculators. I'll put one down in the information section below. Typically when you take this reading, it's going to be lower than your desired gravity because it's not taking into consideration all the water you're going to boil off during the boiling step and adding your hops to finish off your brew day. I think on average you can boil off at around 1 gallon per hour on a typical kettle, but this will change depending on your hardware and your environment. I'd recommend doing a test. Get your kettle to where you typically brew, and collect some water, and then see how much water you boil off in 1 hour. That way you know your boil off rate, and then you can take that pre-boil gravity and your boil off rate and use some calculations online to figure out what your original gravity will be if you don't do anything. You can always add dry malt extract at the last 15 minutes of your boil to adjust if you are under your target pre-boil gravity reading. If you're over it, you can do a dilution calculator to figure out how much water you need to add to hit your target gravity. The ninth thing I want to talk about is reducing oxygen pickup post-fermentation. When you pick up oxygen after fermentation, it can cause an off flavor called oxidation. The attributes that this will have is a cardboard-like or leathery-like, or even like a stale flavor coming off of the beer, so it's definitely something you want to avoid. You can avoid this by avoiding any bulk movement of your liquid after fermentation. So example, no dumping or no pouring your beer into other vessels. For example, key areas where this oxygen pickup will happen is when you're moving your beer from your primary to your secondary fermenter, or if you're bottling, if you're taking beer from your secondary fermenter to your bottling bucket, or even if you're kegging, if you take your beer from your secondary fermenter into your keg. You want to avoid bulk movements when doing all these things. You want to rely on siphons and racking canes and tubing to make sure that you will move beer in the quietest way possible to make sure you're avoiding any oxygen. There are lots of ways to avoid oxygen pickup. Additionally, you can rely on CO2. As CO2 is heavier than oxygen, you can pour CO2 into different vessels or bottles or kegs to make sure that you are displacing the oxygen with CO2 to avoid oxygen pickup. There's also equipment sold on the marketplace to do this. For example, the Blickman sells a piece of equipment called the beer gun, which is specifically to take beer from a keg into bottles and avoid oxygen pickup. So there's lots of different ways to do this, but at a minimum, I would just recommend relying on siphons and tubing, and to make sure you're not dumping and splashing your beer after fermentation in different vessels. Our final item, the 10th item on our list, and the most expensive item, is grain mills. Grain mills is the only way to ensure that you're getting a good crush when you're mashing and to help with your efficiency. The most important thing you're going to have with your brew house efficiency and your mash efficiency is your crush. So in order to have complete control over your crush, the only way to do that is to own your own grain mill. There are lots of grain mills on the market. There's 2 rollers, there's 3 rollers, there's ones with motors, there's ones with hand cranks. So there's lots of grain mills available on the market. If you're interested in looking more into grain mills, I also have a YouTube video on my channel talking specifically over grain mills, and I also talk about my own grain mill. But especially with doing brew in a bag, owning a grain mill is much more important, as well as having a finer crush is going to be key with brew in a bag, as we have the ability to do a fine crush since we're using a bag or some sort of mesh screen. But that about covers it for part 2 of 10 cheap things to better your homebrew. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you haven't seen the first video, make sure to check out the first video as well. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.